Hello, everybody, and welcome to WOW Live, Word on Wednesdays Live. It's great that you could join us this evening. It's great to have you listening in. We're together tonight to begin a topical study on which the Word of God speaks authoritatively as well as foundationally. In fact, the Bible introduces the topic right up front. In Genesis 1:1, we read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." A major part of my spiritual journey has involved the investigation of the subject of origins. From childhood, I've known Genesis 1:1, had it memorized. The verse assumes the existence of God right at the start, which means the Bible itself assumes his existence. There's no effort made in the Scriptures to prove that God is there. The evidence offered for his reality is in his handiwork, in the creation of everything that he's made. Now, in contrast to this theological view is the verdict of the assumed infallibility of a self-correcting human reason. Any time that the limits of this reasoning are pointed out, those limits are dismissed with an assertion that in time, all things will eventually be understood. We may not know it now, but we will solve the problem, right? The late Carl Sagan summarized the starting point of all human reason by also speaking of the existence of all things. He wrote this: "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be." Now, to understand how highly this view is held, and why this idea is constantly taught and touted as the be-all and end-all of reality and existence, just take note that the word cosmos is being treated as a proper noun in this sentence. That's the same way that Genesis 1:11 treats the word God as a proper noun. That makes sense. God is a person. I don't believe the cosmos is a person. Sagan's statement allows no room for God because he said the cosmos is all that ever was, is, or will be. It's clear who Carl Sagan is trying to eliminate. And as the Bible assumes the existence of God, so Carl Sagan and many, many others in the scientific community, the academic community, in the media, education, entertainment, government, and many other arenas operate under the assumption that the cosmos is the only thing that has always been and ever will be. They have to assume it to be so. It has to be an assumption because it's completely impossible to prove the eternal existence of the cosmos. You can't even prove it using science. Here is the ever popular, well-known, well-studied scientific method, which is meant to lead to accurate explanations of the reality around us. You happen to observe a particular phenomenon in nature, and you formulate a question like, how does that happen? What is causing that to happen the way it does? And you look into any available information on that phenomenon to see what others have to say about it. You do your research, and then you postulate a hypothesis to explain the phenomenon. Then you devise an experiment to test your hypothesis, and you observe what happens in the experiment, taking notes on what you are observing. Your notes form the raw data that accompanies the results of your experiment, and then you report your conclusions to others so that they might check your work, and the process may well repeat itself time and again. The problem with trying to determine scientifically what happened in the past is that the past is beyond observation. You cannot observe what actually happened, because you weren't there. You can't go back to Dealey Plaza in November of 1963 and see what happened there, right? You cannot observe what actually happened because you weren't there. Thus, you're going to have a very difficult time coming up with a hypothesis to explain the unobservable phenomena of history. And any experiments done are done to prove or disprove the hypothesis itself, not the phenomena. And if your hypothesis can't capture the essence of that phenomena because the phenomena it remains unobserved, then your hypothesis is kind of your phenomena. You've skipped a whole step in the scientific method, the very first one. And so in this case, you're not completely sure what the phenomena actually was in history. And if it's unrepeatable, which so many things in the subject of origins are unrepeatable, you can't really do an experiment to test that phenomena. You can't repeat it. You can't call the cosmos or God into your laboratory and have them perform for you, right? What other factors may have been in play when you weren't on the scene? You don't even have, in a natural-born phenomena, you don't have those other factors to really adjudicate what's going on. You can't be sure. Here is a burning question found in a hypothetical example. Suppose you enter a room where there's a lit candle sitting on a table, and I ask you the question, how long has that candle been burning? Now, that's surely a burning question if ever there was one. How long has the candle been burning? And so you decide to set up an experiment. You measure the height of the candle presently, and you watch the candle for an hour, and then you measure it again. And you determine the candle has burned down at the rate of 1 inch per hour. Now, that doesn't tell you, though, how long the candle has been burning. To apply your observed burning rate to the phenomena of this burning candle, you'd have to know how tall that candle was to begin with to get any kind of accurate measurement at all. And even if there were some way in which you could figure out how tall the candle might have been and hazard a reasonable guess, how do you know that the burning rate was constantly at 1 inch per hour? You don't. You weren't there to see it. There may have been conditions in the past that are unknown to you. Maybe, for example, I had a window open for a short period of time, and that created a breeze which caused the candle to burn at a higher temperature and thus an increased rate. But you don't know if that happened or not, because you are unable to make any accurate observations of what has happened in the past. And so the past will always and forever be fuzzy, unknown. The idea that the cosmos is all that is, ever was, or ever will be is fraught with similar problems to our candle issue here, not the least of which is the Big Bang that supposedly started it all. If the cosmos came from a Big Bang explosion, as they've been saying for decades now, more than a century, I believe, then how could the cosmos be all that ever was? Because the Big Bang would say that there was a time when the cosmos wasn't. Carl Sagan said he'd solve that one with the idea that at a certain point in the cosmos expansion, the cosmos would begin to collapse back in upon itself and form a central singularity, and then would explode again, starting a new universe. But nobody has any idea of how that idea could actually really happen. And for the cosmos to eventually result in human life, with enough brains to think about things like a cosmos, it sure would take a lot of time and a lot more time for all of that raw material to somehow manage to organize itself. Remember, there is no room for God in the cosmos. You can't call him in and have him fill in the gap for you, according to materialists and their view. So there's no way to get any kind of organization going out of just pure raw material. How does that happen? Things tend to break apart. They don't tend to organize themselves. All you really have here, no God, all you have is matter plus chance and plus time. And time is the big secret, right? Someone once wrote a humorous explanation of the atheistic worldview, and I'm sure you've probably seen it. Atheism, the belief that there was nothing, and nothing happened to nothing, and then nothing magically exploded for no reason, creating everything, and then a bunch of everything magically rearranged itself for no reason whatsoever into self-replicating bits, which then turned into dinosaurs. Makes perfect sense. The big hero in the story of the atheistic worldview is time. The idea is that given enough time, anything is possible. For evolution to have happened, therefore, a lot of time is necessary. So that's why they tell us that the cosmos is billions of years old. But I've got a question. Where did they get the idea that the Earth is billions of years old? Where does that come from? Is this scientifically proven that it's billions of years old? Well, we've already discussed how it really isn't possible to make scientifically conclusive statements about unobservable phenomena, like the Big Bang, or perhaps the eternality of the cosmos. Try observing something that's eternal, which is what Carl Sagan said the cosmos is. Try to observe a one-time event like a Big Bang. I think it's likely that the billions of years is just an idea, a convenience introduced to make a non-theistic universe seem possible. It's not a scientifically solid conclusion that there are billions of years involved. Let's look into the history for a bit of an overview as to where this idea may have come from, how it came about. Before the 1800s, mostly all educators and academicians and scientists generally believed in a young earth. The intellectuals of the West held that the Bible gave an accurate account of a created order done in 6 24-hour days about 6,000 years ago. All science up to that point was pursued and was understood with that worldview in mind. But as the 1700s drew to a close, some began to change their views. Ideas on the origin of things began to be more evolutionary, more changing over time, more naturalistic in perspective, less involvement from the supernatural or God. And some wanted to leave God out of the picture altogether. They were saying that all that was responsible for everything were the forces of time and chance and nature acting upon matter. Now, where time and matter and natural laws came from, I suppose, was not really a problem for them. Kind of a problem to me, but, It's fascinating that 3 of the prominent scientists in this early movement away from the Bible were Frenchmen, because in the late 1700s, France was going through a bloody revolution where reason, human reason, was elevated, and religion, any attention being paid to God, was relegated to an almost non-existent status. France was all about throwing off the elites in their society. They wanted to dump the big chess pieces off the board. So kings and popes and barons and bishops and dukes and the like were all brought down. I used this slide here in our WOW lesson back on January the 6th, 2021, which interestingly enough was the day of a supposed insurrection at our Capitol building. This particular etching is set in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and it's a ceremony extolling the virtues of the goddess of reason. She's seated there, kind of just left of center in this picture, holding the big spear. I said back in January The largest ceremony of all was at the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The Christian altar was dismantled, and an altar to liberty was installed, and the inscription, "To Philosophy," was carved in stone over the cathedral's door. Festive girls in white Roman dress and tricolor sashes milled around a costumed goddess of reason who impersonated liberty. And so there she is in her liberty cap, or the Phrygian cap. Of course, I was the one who added Papa Smurf in there right at her feet, standing in front of the goddess of reason, because he's wearing the same cap that she is. And I thought, well, we just got to get these two together. Anyway, Frenchmen leading the charge on the age of reason in science. The three French scientists of this new age of so-called reason, the ones we want to talk about tonight, are these three. There's Comte de Buffon, lived from 1708 to 1788. There's Pierre Laplace, 1749 to 1827. And Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, 1744 to 1829. So they're all 18th century guys, part of the latter part of the 18th century. Comte de Buffon wrote Epics of Nature in 1778. He said that the Earth was here because a comet had collided with the sun. So the Earth began in this molten lava condition that took 78,000 years to cool off. I don't know where he got the number. Please note, this was not demonstrated in any scientific fashion at all whatsoever. There's no way it could have been, since it was an idea outside the realm of observation and measurement. An author of fantasy tales could have come up with the same idea. But de Buffon had the reputation of being a serious scientist, so his ideas caught on. And it was in a culture and a society where they were trying to throw off the old ideas, including religion, including belief in God, including, of course, the belief in a creator. Pierre Laplace was a little different in that he imagined that the solar system came from a gaseous, nebulous cloud that gradually began to condense over a very long but unknown amount of time to form the sun and the planets. Interesting thing about that idea, the nebulous cloud idea, when I was a child, 5, 6, 7, 8 years of age, I had a book. I can't remember all the details of the book. It was one of those with 2 columns on each page, and the pages were big, and it was really meant for an older child, I believe, but that had pictures, lots of pictures, and there was a picture in there of this nebulous cloud idea. Pierre Laplace's idea, 1960s, right, is in this book, and I can remember the pictures of these nebulous glowing things, and it sort of looked like the sun and some planets in this dark blue field, and it was one of those things that sticks with you as a child, as I look back on it now, I think to myself, this is how we were told about this. This is how we've been presented with this. All these ideas have been pumped through our education system, on television, through books like that, and on and on. So anyhow, just a way in which we encounter ideas and how they become part of our thinking. You could call it brainwashing, or indoctrination might be a better word, but don't allow any other kind of ideas out there. Kind of like the French Revolution, right? Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he organized living things into various categories, Lamarckianism, and he systematized zoology and came up with the idea that acquired characteristics, something that happened to you during your life, could be passed on to future generations. He proposed, for example, that the giraffe gradually developed a long neck over time because it had to stretch higher and higher to reach leaves on trees as trees were getting bigger too. And so the mummy and daddy giraffe stretched and added a little bit to their neck, and so when they had a baby, it started out with that and it stretched and it added a little bit more. The same idea would say this. If we kept chopping off people's left arms, eventually succeeding generations would start having babies with no left arms. The same process would have to be involved as that of the giraffe. It's kind of a ridiculous idea now, but that's what he came up with. Again, these men weren't scientists in the true sense of the word as we understand it. They did little to no experiments at all, especially on the ideas that they came up with. They tested none of their imagined hypotheses. They were theorizers and philosophers who guessed, however educated those guesses might have been in their time. And that guessing was done based on the idea of leaving God out of the equation, which I believe humbly was the entire purpose of the exercise. But it was from men like this that the idea of a very old earth began to be put out there for serious consideration, and more people begin to line up with the idea. Around the turn of the 19th century, geology was just a fledgling science. It became one during the 19th century, and it was from there as well that old Earth ideas started to find some traction, probably especially there. They were trying to get some notice, and so latching on to an idea that already was becoming popular in certain circles probably helped give them some credibility at the outset. Abraham Werner, 1749 to 1817, was a German who studied minerals. His influence actually lived on through those that he taught. Many of the leading geologists of the 19th century were students of Werner. Werner believed that the ocean had once upon a time had covered the entire earth. And you can sort of picture the global flood idea being something of an influence there for Werner. He wasn't concerned about the French Revolution. He was German, so he could hold some religious ideas, I guess. And the ocean began to gradually recede from the earth, leaving behind the different kinds of geological strata through chemical changes. And so that's why you could see all the strata out there, because of the receding water, and it held its level for a while, changed things, and held its level for a while, and there was different chemicals, and it changed things, and so forth. And this had happened over long periods of time, he said. He said that the earth had to be at least 1 million years old. Wow, that's a far cry from Comte de Buffon's 78,000 years after the comet struck the sun. So 1 million years now. While his students didn't keep the receding ocean theory, they did keep the million years. Okay. Again, take note. There's no science here. There's no science being done. These are just ideas being tossed around, growing out of fertile imaginations. A Scotsman by the name of James Hutton, 1726 to 1797, proposed a perpetual cycle concept. He said that the continents of the earth gradually eroded into the sea over time. The sediments from this erosion hardened over time, and then the internal heat of the earth would catastrophically build up pressure and raise up the hardened sediments to form new continents, and the process would then begin again. Gradual erosion, catastrophic upheaval, gradual erosion, catastrophic upheaval, etc. Because of this cyclical idea that he had, Hutton said that he couldn't see that there ever was a beginning to the earth. People were starting to call him an atheist. Well, I guess so. He's just not interested in the beginning, from the beginning of his old ideas. And this is very similar, of course, to what Carl Sagan said about the entire cosmos. It goes out, it collapses on itself, explodes again, and expands, contracts, expands, contracts. Same basic idea, just applied to the whole universe. And again, with Hutton here, there wasn't a lick of scientific proof or even evidence for any of this. It was a whole way of thinking that grew out of the Enlightenment. It came from the French Revolution. It came from the abandonment of biblical views, and so on. This was more rebellion than it was reason. But the idea, the notion of an old earth, was gradually solidifying, just like James Hutton's continents. William Smith, 1769 to 1839, was an Englishman and also a surveyor and a drainage engineer, so he worked in the dirt. Since his work had him digging down into the ground all the time, he made a lot of observation of the strata and of the fossils in them. And it was Smith who developed the idea of dating different rock layers by the fossils that were found in them. By the time Smith came along, the concept of an old Earth was beginning to take hold. And again, we can note that there was nothing scientific about his idea of dating the layers of rocks by the fossils found there. It was a hunch, it was a guess, an imagined idea that was not able to be tested. How could you? The capturing of those fossils was a once upon a time thing. It happened once. It was not repeatable. So it's just a guess. Fossils were also important to Georges Cuvier. 1768 to 1832, a Frenchman. He proposed that the Earth was vastly old. I'm guessing it's beyond the million years that we got from Werner. Because of the fossils and layers, he speculated that there were 4 catastrophic global floods which destroyed all life. After each flood, now Cuvier, interestingly enough, allowed God to come in. God then supernaturally created new life forms. And so every time God was creating, but this earth was vastly old, and these floods kept happening. Cuvier's ideas sound somewhat similar to what some old earth creationists believe even today, and it's not hard to see him as being an influence in those ideas. And we may get into that a little further down the road in this series. Charles Lyell, he's our key man here. He's considered the father of modern geology. He started out with the uniformitarian notions that James Hutton had, that all things sort of happened uniformly. You know, he had the gradual erosion, gradual sedimentation, and the the catastrophic uplift, and then the erosion and sedimentation repeats itself, rinse and repeat, right? And so this is where Lyell got his ideas from James Hutton, and he proposed that everything was uniform, even the catastrophes. Lyell dogmatically began to teach that the geological features of the earth must have formed by slow, gradual processes of erosion, sedimentation, earthquakes, and volcanism on occasion that proceeded at the same rate as are observed in modern times. What we see now has always happened. You know, the present is the key to the past, he said. Earthquakes, floods, and volcanic eruptions, though individually catastrophic in their own local regions, not global, likewise occurred at a uniform rate, so they really didn't impact the overall geological features to any significant extent. He said what we see happening today has always happened at the very same rate of time we see it happening and at the very same rate of change. Therefore, he said, the present is the key to the past. That's Lyell's ideas about geology and about the history of the earth. And he became the father of modern geology. So his idea, uniformitarianism, has hung in there ever since. By the 1840s, well, not even hung in there, it's driven the whole geological understanding of things. By the 1840s, Lyell's theory of uniformitarian geology was accepted everywhere. His idea, the present is the key to the past, is a significant one, and we'll return to it from time to time. Just think about how this same idea might affect biology. That's what Charles Darwin began to do. Let's remember that none of this that these men came up with was proven scientifically. It couldn't be then, nor can it be proven today, because the subject matter that it deals with is outside of the realm of human observation. They're trying to say something about a past which none of them have ever seen. You can't even properly call their ideas theories. That's because they cannot be tested. A theory can be proposed, and it has to be testable to really be called a theory. A more proper term for what these men came up with would be models for the origin of the earth, kind of like the weather models that computer modeling that happens for weather patterns and so forth today. Just think about it. Before 1800, most academics and scientists accepted the Bible as God's Word. But by 1840, the whole academic landscape had changed. The ideas had changed. The concepts had changed. The beliefs had changed. And so the worldview changed with it in less than 100 years. And we're told that this was progress. We're told that it's good that humanity finally came to its senses and realized that all things have happened gradually over long, long periods of time, through the same processes happening at the same rate. We're told that it's a good thing that humans abandoned the idea as creator. I'm looking at Papa Smurf right now, and I'm thinking, what if he is some supernatural entity for evil? The way he's just holding his hand out. See, we tried to tell you, there is no God. The vast age for the earth is not scientific in origin, yet people today maintain that it's a fact, that the universe is 20 billion years old. Or wait a minute, maybe it's a fact that the universe is 10 billion years old. Or, no, wait, it's a fact that the universe is 14.5 billion years old. Now, wait a minute, I think that the latest fact is that the universe is 13.5 billion years old. Okay. See, those are all facts, quote unquote, or estimates on the age of the universe that I've heard in my lifetime. Nobody ever told me about 78,000 years in my lifetime, nor did we ever study about 1 million years, or even vastly old. But all these numbers are ones I remember. To be fair, they have been fairly consistent on their estimate that the Earth itself is about 4.5 billion years old. Still, though, none of these numbers are based on any real science. They are educated hypotheses at best. And a hypothesis, though part of the scientific method, is not in and of itself science. It's just a first step. If you can't move on to the next step, which is testing your hypothesis, you're in trouble. The idea of vast ages of time for everything is a concept that was derived for the purpose of moving modern thinking away from the Bible. I'm convinced of that, because that's what it grew out of in the French Revolution. That was the starting idea. Here is what the father of modern geology, Charles Lyell, said in a letter to a friend and fellow geologist. Have to kind of read between the lines a little bit here to get what's going on. I'm sure, he said, he wrote to him, you may get into QR, the quarterly review, what will free the science of geology from Moses. We have to break it free from the writings of Moses, the book of Genesis. For if treated seriously, if we treat this seriously, the church party are quite prepared for it. A bishop, Buckland ascertained, we suppose Bishop Sumner, gave Urey a dressing in the British Critique and Theological Review. They see at last the mischief and scandal brought on them in the church by Mosaic systems, by things that Moses said. I conceived of the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever the Mosaic geology, read the flood narrative, if the Mosaic geology could ever be set down or put aside without giving any offense to anyone, it would be in an historical sketch. And you must abstract mine, take mine that I've written, in order to have as little to say as possible yourself. It almost sounds like Lyell saying, don't you say too many things, Mr. Scrope, because you'll mess it up. Just read from my stuff, okay? A little bit egotistical, this man, Charles Lyell. He was a lawyer, after all. So, in the early 1800s, Lyell and others wanted to reject the writings of Moses. They're moving away from the Bible, as I said. I found Lyell's quote on the Creation Research website. Along with that quote was this comment by the editor of that article. He says, "It comes as a surprise to many that there was a time when geologists actually accepted a Mosaic or Genesis framework to their thinking. Think of Cuvier talking about God recreating things every time there was a flood. Lyell, the lawyer, knew that no separation exists between a religion or philosophy and the way people look at the world around them. In other words, science. Everything is based on a philosophical outlook, folks. Everybody has things they assume to be true. Everybody has a set of presuppositions, a worldview that they bring to the table, and that is how they interpret the world around them." That's what he's saying. Going on here. Lyell, by advising his followers to reject and replace Moses, Lyell, who kept up the appearance of being a church-supporting believer, as did most UK gentry of the day, was actually establishing an alternative history wherein the authority of the God of Moses over the real world of rocks, fossils, and eventually all living things, including man, was ultimately rejected. Since Jesus warned that those who reject Moses eventually reject his words, it shouldn't surprise us that this is what actually happened to one of Lyell's most devoted disciples, Charles Darwin. In John 5:46 and 47 that the editor referred to, we read this, that Jesus said, "For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings," creation, the flood, the Tower of Babel, the Exodus, "how will you believe my words?" Lyell's uniformitarian ideas that all geological features of the earth have formed by slow and gradual processes over millions of years of time became broadly accepted by the mid-19th century. People came to doubt the words of Moses, and the idea that the earth was very old has become the predominant assumption. And it's an assumption, it's not a fact. And it's so widely believed and accepted that it's pretty much considered to be a fact. But it's not. It's considered to be a fact even though there's no science to prove it. But someone might say, well, what about the geologic column? Now, doesn't that show that the earth is old? All the layers and everything and how they slowly formed and everything else. Well, notice the underlying assumption there is that they form slowly. Okay, that's key. Here's a copy of the geologic time scale. Kind of a common one. You see it a lot when you look for this. Supposedly, this represents all the different layers of the rock strata. You see all the different names there on the left-hand column and numbers of years, MY, millions of years, right? Okay. Supposedly, that represents those layers. And you know the routine. The farther down you go into the Earth's crust, the farther back in time you travel. You've got 2.5 million years at the top and 500 to 600 million years, 500 million years down at the bottom. First, please note, there's only one place that you will ever find the geologic column, and that is in the textbook in a picture like this. You see, it's an idea, all right? It's not an actual physical reality anywhere. There is no place on the surface of the planet where all of the geologic layers on this particular chart can ever be found stacked together in one location. It's not clearly laid out like that. Here's what happened. This chart represents a composite effort, a composite of different layers found in different locations all over the world in the order that they think those layers were formed. So there's a subjective nature to this geologic column. But this is the time scale that is used to date the rocks. If a fossil is found, this chart is consulted to see how old the fossil is. Where does it fall in the chart? All you have to do is determine which rock layer the fossil was in. The rock layer will tell you then the age of the fossil based on this chart. But how do you determine which layer is which in the field when you're actually out there? Well, they do that by means of index fossils. Okay? Index fossils. There's certain fossils that are index fossils, a different fossil or two for every layer. If you find a particular kind of fossil present in the layer of rock in which you found the fossil you're trying to date, well then you'll know what layer you're dealing with. Here's a chart showing the index fossils for the different layers. These fossils tell you the age of the rock layer, and it's pretty simplified there to see what's what in the different ones. All over the world, North America, South America, Africa, Europe, nothing from Asia, but anyhow. Now wait a minute, though. Wait just a minute. A few moments ago, I told you that the rock layers date the fossils. Now I just told you that the fossils date the rock layers. Okay, so the fossils, the rocks date the fossils, and the fossils date the rocks. That's kind of circular reasoning, isn't it? You're kind of circling back, as is common in political discussion these days. Yeah, it's circular reasoning, all right. And there's no way for the geologist to escape this faulty way of thinking. It's a logical fallacy to have two things interreferencing each other and using one as the support for the other and then the other as the support for the one and back and forth like that. In fact, geologists will admit that it's circular. For example, in a 1979 interview with Dr. Donald Fisher, the state paleontologist for New York, Sunderland asked him, "How do you date fossils?" And his reply was, "By the Cambrian rocks in which they were found." So he's dating them by the rocks. And then Sunderland asked him if that's not circular reasoning. And Fisher replied, "Well, of course. How else are you going to do it? It's a necessary thing, see?" In an article entitled Pragmatism versus Materialism in Stratigraphy that was published in the American Journal of Science in January 1976, J.E. O'Rourke wrote, "The rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately. Stratigraphy cannot avoid this kind of reasoning, because circularity is inherent in the derivation of time scales." See, this is admitting, basically, with this problem, this is admitting we can't see what happened. We're only able to depend on what we see in front of us, and it's not enough to be accurate. That's basically what's going on. The concept of the vast age of the earth is based upon imaginary ideas that men have come up with an inability to observe them. They are therefore improvable assumptions, and it's also based on circular reasoning such as this. There is nothing scientific about the vast age of the earth that they tell us today. Hence, what we have reviewed here, folks, is the framework that makes up the evolutionary worldview. Any evidence that is found or observed today is interpreted using this framework, using this set of assumptions that the earth is old. That's an assumption, that it's millions of years old, 4.5 billion to be exact, that life is about 1 billion years old, that the Cambrian explosion happened about 500 million years ago, that the dinosaurs died out about 65 million years ago. All these things are assumptions because they're all based on what we talked about tonight. That's the key thing. The geologic column, index fossils, rock layers, that's all used to determine the age of things. And the age of the earth itself is based on guesswork, hypotheses, imaginative thinking. Therefore, you can't point to the evidence available today and say that this proves your worldview, because really, you have to use your worldview to interpret the evidence. And that's true of anyone, including the Christian. The important thing and difference I'd like to note here is, as Christians, we admit that we're using our belief system to interpret the world around us we admit that there needs to be something from outside of ourselves to give us guidance on these kinds of issues. What happens when you try to create it without God is what happens and what we described here tonight. So, we're going to continue in this line of thinking for a little while and then talk about some other things having to do with the origins issue. Now, I do want to tell you this. Next week, before I tell you that, I want to point out something. A good bit of what I came up with, I use several sources, but especially with the various geologists and early scientists in the late 1700s into the early 1800s and up through the 19th century, comes from this book by Terry Mortensen. Okay, it's kind of hard to get his name without a glare here. There we go. Terry Mortensen, The Great Turning Point. There was a point where everything turned. We noted suddenly everybody changed their viewpoint on things, and so this is where he's done most of his work, and he does a fantastic job of describing scriptural geologists and the fight that they had at the time to try to maintain the scripture and preserve their integrity in the fledgling science of geology. But this uniformitarian idea came along and overtook them. And it's an interesting study about the way people will change their minds. Not because they have a better idea, because they have an idea that they want to follow. Anyway, next week, there will be no WOW Live because I'll be away. I'll be away the whole week. So we're going to meet again in 2 weeks. Please make a note of that. I hope that you enjoyed some of this. Any feedback you give me on what we've said, any questions you might have, please shoot me a message in Messenger or send me an email, call me, whatever. Text me if you have my phone number. If you want my phone number, just let me know and we can set something up with that. In any case, thank you so much for paying attention tonight, and we'll see you again real soon.